Hello and welcome to one of the Einstein Forum's first online-only lectures. I am extremely happy to welcome Benjamin Zachariah, who is currently a senior research fellow at a research group at the University of Trier on the contemporary history of historiography, and who has wide-ranging interests in 20th century history, particularly Indian history, on which he has published a number of really interesting books. And he's going to speak to us today about global fascisms and international cooperation among the far right. I'm really looking forward to that.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I hope a subject such as this can be presented in a more or less coherent manner in a short amount of time, and also in a way without resorting to a kind of shorthand that creates more trouble than it's worth. What I'd like to start by saying is that the problem of looking at fascisms not as something that came out of Italy and then went to Germany and then maybe moved to a few other places in Europe, but to look at it as a global phenomenon, both in its own times and in its later avatars, is something that has been very difficult to do, especially if you're based out of a place like Germany, where fascism, if it's used at all, and if it isn't said to already dilute the specificities of Nazism, it's supposed to be something very particularly terrible and in some ways has created in Germany a nationalism in reverse. Nobody can possibly be as terrible as we are. And so the standards for fascism are set impossibly high by the telos of Auschwitz. And of course, that takes away from the fact that, at least in the first part of the 20th century, fascism was recognizably global. And by this, I mean not simply the question of whether the Italians tried to export their kind of political system to other parts of the world, which they did, but also that there was a recognizable family of ideas which we can label fascism after its first really successful achievement, if you like, at capturing state power. So I usually start talking about fascisms in terms of a distinction I find useful, that is to look at fascism in search of state power and fascism after it has achieved state power. This is obviously a distinction that helps us look at unsuccessful fascist movements. And the other distinction is fascism in its own time, when it has its vocabulary more or less worked out, and fascism in, if you like, an afterlife, where we call it neo-fascism or various things, where its original language of legitimation has somewhat been disrupted, as a result of which it has to bring itself back in a different form. But so far, so abstract, I wanted to start off with a little incident that appeared in the Indian public domain not so long ago. If we talk, for instance, about what I have always considered the longest running fascist organization in the world, it's the paramilitary group in India that now gives the government its muscle and has also ideologically and disciplinarily yielded various prime ministers, including the current one. The Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sabha, which will now be referred to as the RSS, founded in 1925. And the incident I'm referring to comes a little bit from the fact that the German ambassador visited the headquarters of this organization and tweeted about it, saying that founded 1925, it is world's largest voluntary organization, though not uncontroversially perceived through its history. Now, if you can follow the small print on this tweet, there's immediately a response saying, doesn't anybody know that these are people who were inspired by the Nazis and by Mussolini? And it was taken up by a few people in the Indian media, but it made it to the Jerusalem Post, which made it a sort of small international incident. And it was really only talked about briefly in Germany, where a young journalist picked up the story, Nathalie Mayroth, but nothing much came of it. But when this gentleman on the right is the German ambassador Walter Lindner, photographed there with the personification of the country India, with the current head of the RSS, and behind him an earlier head of the RSS, who gives us this famous statement about how to define nationhood. And this is something he wrote in 1939, deciding that India should model itself on Germany, who is purging itself of Jews, and India should do the same, presumably for Muslims. I'll leave you with that for a minute, and then come out of it to suggest that this collaboration, if you like, of fascists across the world is not something that we needed to wait for Anders Breivik's manifesto for. Now, those who remember Anders Breivik will remember that he was the Norwegian who attacked various socialist school children at a socialist school children's camp. And when he had murdered enough and had given himself up, it was discovered that he had written a very long manifesto, which quoted from all kinds of right-wing sources, including substantively from the Hindu right in India. Why is this vaguely important? I think that the phenomenon of fascism has usually been reduced to the idea that there is an original fascism and then there are copies which are either badly copied or misunderstood copies. And so it's as if it's somehow European blood in a kind of inversion of their own ideology that gives you the real thing. And even within Europe, there are hierarchies. So the Romanian fascists never really make it to proper fascist status. Yes, even Spain doesn't quite figure, or Portugal, but definitely Italy and Germany become paradigmatic. This is, of course, the fact comes partly from the fact that you need at least two instances to generalize, and the second incident, being the German incident, suddenly got people thinking. Mostly the first theorizers of fascism were the communists, and for various reasons they had so many arguments among themselves that when they finally came out with a definition, it was both obsolete and a bit static. Again, from past to present, and I show you a copy of a book which has been edited by a German friend of mine who did not wish to see such a thing on my bookshelf, but this is the Indian edition that is easily found on every street corner bookshop in India. This particular one, the publication detail will tell you it went through a great many editions very quickly, but it's not the only edition. Yeah? And I won't bore you with the bits of it, but the fact that Adolf Hitler is an idol among the Hindu right today is an indication that at least the imagery and the power tendencies of fascism remains quite important. Now, I thought maybe if I had some time to talk about the first real collaborations, but also the fact that collaborations didn't necessarily happen in terms of a past, a present, and the future of the same movement, and also that it wasn't unidirectional, then I think we might be getting somewhere. But
maybe if I can interject briefly before we move back into the 1930s. I find it fascinating to hear about the fact that you can buy Mein Kampf on every corner in India.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember that in the German press, regularly you can read reports about countries like India or Vietnam saying that someone opened a Cafe Hitler, or some other institution that makes reference to German National Socialism, and this is usually explained as these people in faraway Asia not really getting the historical context of Europe, and we need to educate them about why this is wrong. But I gather from what you just told us that some of these people may be getting the context very well, in fact, and maybe making references to very specific things that they know about.
Well, that's true. And I think it hasn't been helpful at all that the kind of patronizing view of non-Europe among Europeans has led to this idea that somehow if a non-European gets hold of a fascist idea, they can only possibly dilute it or misunderstand it, right, and therefore it's somehow not dangerous. Now, I mean, of course, there are hierarchies there too. The Latin Americans take their fascisms more seriously than the Asians. So there is that. I thought that actually among the things that one can productively look at is what I would like to call a fascist repertoire. And I think the idea of a fascist repertoire is something I prefer to what many theorists call a fascist minimum. Mm-hmm. Because a fascist minimum requires you to have a checklist of all these things, and then somebody is looking at a political project to see if it contains enough of these elements to cross the minimum. And they might disagree as to what the minimum is, people do. But that's a kind of decontextualized assertion. And I think a repertoire is interesting because a repertoire doesn't rely on all the elements at once, and it requires a certain political context for certain elements to come out. Now, this is especially true in a context where we're talking about neo-fascism, where, of course, there's not much neo about it in many cases, except that the language of legitimation has been rephrased. Now, when you talk about an organization like the RSS that has never been properly discredited, their major achievement till date was the murder of one Mahatma Gandhi. They seem to have been able to maintain their uninterrupted existence and their old language of legitimacy. So to call the RSS a neo-fascist organization would be a mistake. In the 1930s, they actually sent people to Italy to learn from Mussolini's gang. They came back with ideas as to how to build a paramilitary to actually be an effective organ of violence and also of organizing all people behind the organic nation. So I look at the repertoire as a claim to an organic and primordial nationalism, a controlling statism that disciplines the member of the organic nation to act as, for, and in the organic nation. And obviously this refers to an aspiration to have a state, which doesn't necessarily always end in getting hold of that state. The nation must be purified and preserved by cleansing it of its impurities, for which purpose the paramilitarist tendency is very important. And in order to keep all of this going, this sense of continuous crisis and alarm about the potential danger of the organic nation is always preserved. And the use of political violence itself is somehow always purificatory. Now, the relationship between a movement that explicitly states all of this and a legal or quasi-legal political organization has been explored in detail for Nazi Germany. So the model is well known. The argument is that you must have access to violence, which the official and parliamentary part of your movement can easily disavow, but linked to when it needs to. Why I find this important to stress is that you actually have plenty of potential there to keep a movement going for a longer period. And in a case such as India, where nobody actually discredited the fascists or even called them fascists for long enough. I mean, there's a Cold War context to this also, because they adopted an anti-communism early enough for American intelligence sources to label them as a quasi-fascist or a fascist movement, but nonetheless continue to support and fund them. So the RSS in its first avatar was not particularly successful. It had a long period of continuity, and it comes into its own, if you like, in the 20th century. And in the late 20th century and in the early 21st century, it's when it has a regime phase. But I want not to go so far as to simply look at that. I want to linger really on what I think of as a formative period, which, if you like, is a period where all political movements across the world recognize each other's affinities. This is certainly true of left movements, but since left movements have a universalist tendency, it's quite easy to see that from the outside, as well as to see how it is avowed from inside. But fascist movements have what we might call a disavowed internationalism, where since each nationalism is supposed to have its own authentic genius and pure folk, it cannot really acknowledge the extent to which it collaborates, although, of course, it does. What is reasonably well known, because people move from the German case or the Italian case onwards, is that the Germans invoked the Aryans quite often. And according to various mythologies co-produced in Europe and Asia, the Indians were an Aryan people. In some versions, including in Mein Kampf, Indians were degenerate Aryans because they had miscegenated too much with the original inhabitants of India. But in a lot of ideological cases, the mixing of the category of Hindu and Aryan and so on was quite useful. It comes to a large extent out of something called the Theosophical Movement. And the Theosophical Movement it's a Russian movement to some extent, but it's also an American movement. And it postulates the rise of humanity through 7 great races, the Aryan being the topmost of them. And it also has another peculiar idea, which is a kind of Christian teleology in some respects, but is supposedly universal, that the improvement of a human being undertaken in his or her own lifetime, but also across several lifetimes, would lead an ordinary human being to become a Mahatma or a Christ. This is their argument. And this kind of evolutionary Superman idea, if you like, plays well with a number of people, including early versions of Aryophiles, who were very important in Austria and do actually play a role in the early Nazi movement, more in Austria than anywhere else. It's also true that the Indian student organizations in Vienna in the 30s flew the Nazi flag long before the Anschluss. Now, these weird details come and go. You get glimpses of them in the archives, but you would miss them if you weren't looking. And for me, I actually started looking when I couldn't ignore the signals anymore, when every time I thought it was an aberration, it was in fact not an aberration. So I suppose I probably started off myself by thinking that these mutual recognitions were a little strange. So if I were to then briefly talk about one particular organization, because I think it's important to situate these collaborations in something. And it's a very early organization set up in Munich in the 1920s called the Deutsche Akademie. And the Dutch Academy had a teaching unit for German language teaching called the Goethe Institute, and it had an academic exchange program called the Deutsche Akademische Austauschdienst. Both the names and more or less the organization survive. By 1928, the Dutch Academy had an Indian department, and it was partially run by two men who had a history of being nationalists in India of a Felkish variety, one Binoy Kumar Sarkar and one Taraknath Das. Das had been in Italy with the fascists before he moved to Germany. Sarkar had been in many places, including Japan. And when they got together in Munich, they also started a scholarship program for Indians who were to be trained in Munich. This was, of course, a rival training program to the one set up in Berlin by the left wing, who were affiliated to the Communist Party. So there was a very conscious knowledge of left and right in all of this. Sarkar was famous for being the kind of academic who is now celebrated in post-colonial circles. There are, in fact, post-colonial articles saying how wonderful he was, but he was a Nazi. And one of the things he did best was to say, whatever is being discussed in European philosophy today, well, we had it first. And so all ancient wisdom that we can provide to the world shows how modern we were even before the ancients. Now, what he didn't do was he didn't quite pull the spiritual act. But in 1933, when Hitler came to power, Sarkar wrote a book called The Hitler State, which celebrates the coming of Hitler. And one of the points he made was that Hitler brings together the iron determination of a Bismarck with the necessary spiritual, this is his word, characteristics that will make the Germanic people a great race, finally, as they come into their own. And there was, at the time, the first successful God-man in India, a man called Vivekananda, who became famous in the 1893 Congress of Religions by talking about Hinduism as a great religion. So Sarkar described Hitler as Vivekananda multiplied by Bismarck. The organization, of course, trained a number of people, and they sent Deutsche Lektoren to India as propagandists for the Reich. When the Nazis came to power, the Deutsche Academy became a part of the NSDAP Auslandsorganisation, the foreign department of the National Socialist Party, and was therefore directly controlled by the Nazis. Interestingly enough, in the denazification procedures after the Second World War, one of the arguments made by various members of this organization to show that they couldn't really have been Nazis was that they had Indian members. This apparently absolved them of that, but it was reasonably inconvenient that a number of these Indian members had said quite a lot about how they admired the Nazis. Now, that's my only situative example in this, but I think that I want to open it out a bit and make a few more points by way of conclusion, which unfortunately there isn't, because we are still in the middle of a new era of international right-wing and fascist collaboration. What, if you like, is the point of calling something fascist? Well, on the one hand, it does imply a certain attempted coherence on their part. On the other hand, it is, as we know, most political terms are both descriptive and evaluative. And it is an evaluative term, and we wish it to be, because I think a lot of academic as opposed to activist thinking about fascism is based on waiting till they're sure it is fascism. By the time that happens, politically, it's way too late. And we might actually have a much firmer thesis, but it is really politically well past the time when something can be done about it. And some of these prophecies were always meant as self-abnegating prophecies rather than as self-fulfilling ones. By which I mean you try to actually create a typology to show that a movement is tending in the direction of, say, fascism, which we presume is for many people an undesirable outcome, so that enough people are interested in organizing against that outcome. Unfortunately, today, those of us who thought of ourselves not only as academics, but also as interested players in the activist game, have found that although we're much more relevant as academics because what we feared and to some extent predicted is with us, we are also in the awkward situation where we don't really want to be examining the tendencies and the individual elements of various right-wing organizations to see whether it's fascism proper or nearly there, or whether it's crossed the line. And I think that's our tragedy today.
Thank you. This is a very original look, and I want to jump in right away by saying that in fascist studies, there is a traditional tension between completely historicizing the phenomenon, as you said, and digesting a set of a fascist minimum, or in your terms, a fascist repertoire that could be used to identify the phenomenon, perhaps not ahistorically, but into the present. Now, I'm wondering, taking you up on the activist point, what exactly the point might be of applying this label to a phenomenon today? Because presumably, when we say that some political movement or some government or regime even is fascist, we're implying a certain type of outcome. But historically, the outcomes of different fascist movements and different fascist regimes have been very different. And just by attaching the fascist label to a certain phenomenon, we can't really be sure what exactly the outcome might be. So what then exactly is the point of, I don't know, let's say calling the Trump regime a political regime with fascist tendencies? What can we help predict certain specific outcomes by bringing it closer to the historical family of fascist movements?
I mean, I think to answer the last part of your question first, yes, we can. We can actually see the kind of tendencies in a political order to the dehumanizing of certain kinds of people, to the delegitimization of certain kinds of activity, to the marginalization of people to the point at which they're no longer considered human. Having said that, I think we have to be careful that we see this both genealogically and teleologically, because if you see it genealogically, then a lot of movements that started off with many similar trends to fascism either branched off or stopped, or in fact at some point even saw themselves as heading in the wrong direction or in a dangerous direction. And if you look at a lot of thinking about society at the turn of the 19th and 20th century, then there's this kind of original morass of ideas which can lead in many directions. When it starts to branch off, say by the 1920s or by the end of the First World War, then people are keen to make the distinctions between what is likely to go in a direction they don't want to see and what they are wishing to see. So those debates can actually be reactivated at a time like this when, of course, certain tendencies are visible which have not really led to a fully fledged movement or a regime phase. That's the political side of it. There's also the political economy side of it, which tends to be overlooked because we don't really have a direct analogy from the 20s and 30s to the period of liberal capitalism in a highly consumerized set of societies, and how that relates to societies where this liberal capitalism is superimposed on a situation of great poverty and lack of purchasing power is also something that needs considering.
So maybe in the light of that, let me try to rephrase the question. You have also done quite a lot of work on Marxism and its relevance to historiography. And one of the things that you've written recently that I really loved was the observation that history plays an extremely important role in Marx's writings and in the sort of theoretical edifice of Marxism, but some Marxists have tended to see Marxism as an ahistorical set of explanations and solutions to almost everything. Now, if we apply that to the fascism formula, I mean, isn't there an argument to be made to say, well, there was a certain fascist moment in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, where we are seeing a family of phenomena that are made similar, not just by a set of internal similarities, but also by a set of structural similarities in the historical context in which they arose. You know, social structure, global economic crisis, the upheaval after the First World War, etc. And if we then try to extend that into the present moment, even if we can identify very, very clear continuities in the specific movements, isn't the historical context now so different that we really need a new word or a new analysis for what we're seeing now if we are to come up not just with a good academic explanation, but also with a good practical response? I mean, are there any practical reactions to these things that were developed, let's say, in the 1930s, that we could still apply today simply because we're still seeing something that's fascist?
So, I mean, just to start at the beginning of what you said, I think that we're talking about conjunctures, right, where a number of elements come together to give us the possibility of a fascist regime, a fascist state, and a set of fascist movements. So if you think about the work of somebody like Sternhell, he would be arguing that there's nothing really new about what comes together in the 1920s. It's been around since the late 19th century, but it doesn't have the historical context where it can take hold. And I think in the similar way, we can argue by analogy and disanalogy, and we could argue about whether there is a moment now at which a new kind of fascism can take hold. Now, a lot of what we've been discussing is the political form that fascism takes. Right? Now, I'm not sure there is an essence behind that, which gives you the real fascism, that you need the same kind of economic crises that you had from the late 20s through the 30s into the Great Depression and so on to bring about the real fascism. You do already, though, have one very strong political economic form that is visible across a number of regimes, which is the coming together of corporate capital and regimes. So certainly in India, there's a group of very small number of capitalists who have coalesced around the regime. Certainly in the United States, you can actually talk about the support for Trump being a certain kind of corporate capital. But we don't want to push the analogy so that if it's not a direct comparison, then we can abandon it altogether. I think what worries me is, again, this idea that you have to have an absolutely perfect congruence of all elements before you can use the analytic. I mean, and I think it needs to be clear at all points what we are looking at. Now, of course, in terms of the political impact of a paramilitary group that owes its allegiance to a fascist past, takes its legitimation from a fascist past, and is out murdering people, whether that's small groups in Germany, which are still really very active, or the Ku Klux Klan or the RSS, we are still talking about a very real danger to the lives of people. And to say, well, they're not really fascist, but they have fascist allegiances, doesn't make for much of a distinction to me, although I accept that it is a distinction.
And I guess this brings us back to something that you said at the very beginning when you commented on the German debate, which I thought was very perceptive. So you said that in Germany, the standards for comparison are set impossibly high by what you call the tailors of Auschwitz. And indeed, when I look at German debates about these things, what tends to happen is that when someone makes a comparison that in any way involves the National Socialist period, probably 95% of the debate will be about whether or not that comparison is legitimate and whether or not that person has the right to make that comparison. And in the end, the question of what to do practically about the phenomenon that's being compared tends to kind of take a back seat. And, you know, I don't even want to mention any specific debates because I think this is a general trait of many, many debates that we've seen. So there's a kind of dynamic of scandalization. But that, of course, may be one of the problems, once again, with trying to salvage the fascist labels, that certainly in a country like Germany, because of these historically grown sensitivities, as soon as you call something fascist, even if you have extremely good reason to do so, instead of helping find a constructive response to that phenomenon, you know, a phenomenon such as the horrifying murders in Germany of people with, you know, foreign-sounding names, which I think is one of the most important events in recent decades, really, in German history. Instead of, you know, finding a constructive response to that, a lot of the debates get diverted into this never-ending question of, are we allowed to make that comparison or not?
I mean, the obvious point there is, how do you know something is unique unless you have made a comparison? So I don't believe that this makes a lot of sense to me. I think the polemics of comparison sometimes overpower everything else, but I think it's perfectly legitimate to make the comparison, but to make it carefully. And when it is a polemic, it's up to somebody to say, well, if you think something is apartheid, were you around when apartheid was happening, or did you research it? You can't just use it as a slogan, right? For instance. Equally, if that's the case for apartheid, it must be the case for fascism, that you actually have to look at a case and see how close or how distant it is. You must also see it as a continuity in the sense that you don't have to wait till something is a fully fledged regime with a fascist paramilitary behind it before you see the problem. Now, again, a lot of the reason why small gangs of paramilitary groups who go around killing people of foreign origin need to be stopped and also to be seen in continuity with fascism is that they need to be stopped. Having said that, I'm perfectly willing to concede that the Germans had the best and the most efficient fascism ever. That doesn't mean there aren't any others.
Right.
I mean, even the idea of a Holocaust or of genocide. Genocide is a definition that might come out of one context, but it is meant to be applied to other contexts. It is a legal definition.
Right. My point was more of a practical one. I mean, even if I completely agree with you on an intellectual level, I'm wondering whether in some contexts it might not be useful for pragmatic purposes to bracket out the comparison, simply because so many people, for a number of reasons, have this almost allergic reaction to it.
I mean, I can see why mobilizationally you might actually want to say, we want your support to stop people getting murdered, whether you think this is fascism or not. And I think that's a distinction that most people would accept. And I think I've been in situations where I think something is fascist and somebody doesn't, but we are still actually able to act together in a very concrete manner. I think what's important is to see a tendency, but not to be dogmatic about the label necessarily, but to still continuously, if you think it is a tendency, point out the tendency.
Right. So maybe before we stop, if you look at the world today with the historical background that that you've talked about, where do you see, to put it maybe briefly, the main fascist hotspots? Where do you see the main phenomena where you think we can identify fascist tendencies?
I mean, the problem is usually that no one researcher knows enough about more than their little corner. So I would definitely point to India as a major corner. I think the main danger in India is that since there's never been a discredited fascism, nobody's actually noticed that there are already concentration camps that have been built for those excluded from citizenship by the new Citizenship Act. They're not yet death camps, but are we going to wait? Now, the kind of exclusionary politics that is being built has been spotted by other people in the US context. But what I find actually refreshing about the US is there's a much stronger counter argument and a much stronger counter mobilization than in a country like India, which makes me fear for something like that. But I mean, I think the main difficulty for me is not that there will be one country that will come forward as a fascist state, but that everybody else will allow it to happen. It is the Lindner case, the German ambassador's case, is actually symptomatic. Never again seems to apply only to your own backyard. You're okay if the Germans don't get to be fascists. Otherwise, you can call a fascist organization a slightly controversial social work organization and go and visit them in their office and have a good cup of tea. So, I mean, where is the danger? I think the central danger is the re-legitimization of what we would call paleo-fascism. So neo-fascism doesn't need a new language anymore. There's the whole discredited paraphernalia of the fascist era is back and is with us.
That is a scary note to end on. So maybe I'll ask one more question. I don't know if that'll be more optimistic, but if you were to speculate on the possible effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, and it has been argued that, for example, the 1918 pandemic of the Spanish flu, in some places at least, contributed to a political radicalization and was one of the many building blocks in kind of the background that led to the rise of fascist movements. Are you seeing anything in India or in other places that you're familiar with that might be grounds for worry in a similar kind of direction?
I mean, there's a very simple and very direct correlation in the Indian case. There were massive demonstrations against the new Citizenship Amendment Act. There was mobilization in every big city. Every public square was fully occupied. And under cover of the COVID-19 crisis, all of this was demobilized. And then as soon as everybody was home, particular intellectuals, particular student leaders were arrested. They're now being held without trial. You can look at Hungary, where within the European Union, somebody has more or less declared himself a dictator. And nobody's in the least bit concerned. And if they are concerned, they're going to keep very politely quiet about it because, oh no, there can't be dangers of authoritarianism or fascism within Europe. Europe is now somehow immune, whereas once it was the origin of all these things. Now, I don't quite understand how these typologies work, but I think a lot of them work by creating taboos about what political language you can use. And I think, although I'm very careful about the political language I use, and I wouldn't say something that I can't back, I think if you told me, no, you simply cannot use certain words anymore, then I would want to know why this makes for a good argument, especially when it does establish at least the fact that the authoritarian tendency towards controlling populations, towards denial of civil rights, towards denial of public space, they have come piggyback with what is undeniably a major public health crisis. And whereas you would have to work very carefully to disaggregate the measures which are medically justified from the measures which are politically repressive, there definitely has been an opportunist use of increased state power by authoritarian regimes.
Right. Well, thank you very much for, I can't say an optimistic take, but certainly a very, very illuminating lecture. And we will post this online. And I hope that we can transfer at least some of the very vivid discussions that we usually have on site at the Einstein Forum in Potsdam into a new online format, which is as new to us as it is to everyone. So thank you again, Benjamin.
Thank you for the invitation. It was a great pleasure to speak to you.